Good afternoon, everyone. It's been great to be able to catch up with people today, and lots of people that I've seen. It's been especially country people who I don't get to see enough, and to be able to catch up with some of you guys. John said before when he was showing some of that data, kind of rhetorically, of course, saying, why would you come to South Australia when he was showing just the achievement data? And in the conversations that I was having with people over lunch, it reminded me why we came to South Australia. When I visited South Australia years ago now, before we came, I went to South Australian schools and sat down with the kids, and the way that the kids could talk about their learning, that was what I think made it so that I wanted my kids to be educated in the South Australian public system, and that was a fantastic decision for us, a really good decision for us that's worked well. And so, hearing that student voice and some of the work that I've been hearing about around that student voice, and the things that John's been talking about today, getting kids in on that conversation, I think South Australia, as John has said, is really leading the way. And so I really do want to pick up on where John left off, really, and dig a bit deeper into some of the South Australian story, into some of the South Australian data. But before I talk about the data, I just wanted to start to think about what it is about the data that we notice. What's underneath the surface of the data. And this is William James. William James is often called the father of psychology. And one of the things that he talked about was how my experience is what I agree to attend to. And that only those items which I notice shape my mind. And without some selection, without selective interest, my experience is an utter chaos. And so thinking about what we're going to agree to attend to within our data, what we're going to agree to attend to within our narrative in our sites, is very similar to what the kids agree to attend to, what the kids notice and how that shapes their minds. And so when I'm talking about the data, what I'd really like you to think about is, what's underneath that, and of course the kids that are underneath that. If we think about that kind of what I agree to attend to, and without it, it's utter chaos. Of course, in the early years, one of the things that very young children do is they attend to everything. This is a picture book from an Argentinian author who talks about the Meninos, a baby boy. And the baby boy sees and hears much more than you would think. He records everything in his portable memory. It all goes in. There's no selection. Except the selection starts because he's a mirror. And so that mirroring gives meaning to, gives some salience to these experiences that he's having. And he starts to be selective about what he's valuing and what he's not valuing and what's going in. And if we take this a step further and think about the way that kids notice. This is from a book called Sidewalk Flowers, and what you can see in that first panel is a little girl going for a walk with a dad, and there she is at her height, not the adult height, going around and noticing the bloke with the tats on the top right-hand corner there, and the woman in the car. And as she goes around, she's having this quite different experience of the world. She's agreeing to attend to different things, and she notices these flowers, and she picks the flowers, and the story is about picking the flowers. But where she goes on to, what she does with the flowers, the way that she finds meaning with those flowers, the way that she chooses to act, the things that she chooses to notice, have of course been shaped by her experience and the people that have helped her with her development. And so when we talk about the data, I think what I want you to try and think about is that idea, Carl Rinaldi's idea of the competent child. What does a competent child look like? What does a competent child look like in my site, whether it be early years, primary, high school, senior, second years? What does that competent child look like? And how, in our data and in our narrative, can we see that development going on of that competent child, responding to John's challenge around growth, that development of competence within that child? I wanted to respond as well to some of the things that were in the advertiser over the weekend, some of the things about the NAPLAN data. So I'm going to talk about the data, but I don't want to lose sight of the competent child as I do. We can't get hold of the national NAPLAN data, except of course News Corp has allowed us to do that and extract some of the my school data. I'm going to show you some primary schools data. The high schools data is too messy. There's too much inconsistency within that particular data set. I've had a look at it, and I think the high school data tells exactly the same story as the primary data. So I'm showing you the primary data, but I think it holds for high schools, and I think, if we think about it in terms of the competent child, we can think about it from an early years point of view as well. So what I've showed here is, across the bottom we've got the ICSEA, the measure of essentially of social economic status, of disadvantage, and then the average score in NAPLAN numeracy in this case. And what I've shown you there is all of the Australian government schools. Let me show you across Australia, the non-government schools. Now let's overlay on top of that the Australian government schools, the South Australian government schools, sorry. So those are our government schools, our primary schools. And I'll lay on top of that the South Australian non-government schools. So there's a number of things within this data that we see. So we've got this achievement. We've clearly got a relationship between achievement and ICSEA, and that the non-government schools are certainly no different from the government schools. Any higher scores that non-government schools get in things like NAPLAN come from having higher ICSEA kids. There's certainly no clear difference between government and non-government schools, and in high school, it looks like the government schools are actually outperforming the non-government schools when you correct for ICSEA. But what I wanted to do with this data is to say, okay, so we've talked about growth, but where do we get growth from? What's the South Australian growth story? How do we generate that? So let's have a look at all the schools that are around about an ICSEA of 1,000. And so ICSEA is not the same measurement of disadvantage that we use in our categorization, but it's round about category 4. Most of the schools that have this ICSEA around about 1,000 are category 4 schools. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take that slice through and pull that slice out, and let's have a look at the distribution of NAPLAN scores in those primary schools around about an ICSEA of 1,000. So what we can see here is the red is the South Australian government schools, and you can see very few with very low scores, very few with very high scores, and that pretty close to a bell-shaped curve in the middle. The blue is the South Australian non-government schools. And we might be tempted to pick out individual bits and pieces of data, individual scores, but if we just look at the overall shape, really this just tells us that the overall shape. If we just look at the overall shape, there is no difference between government schools and non-government schools. If I take away the non-government schools and replace it with Australian government schools, so now what we can see is South Australian government schools compared to Australian government schools. And what you can see is really two bell-shaped curves. The Australian government schools in green and the South Australian in red. And so, as we know, there's some challenge for us here in this area. Pushing forward, as John talked about, pushing forward that front end, getting our best kids to be better. And we've got a bit of a bulge on that left-hand side as well, on that lower score, so that's pulling up those students who are not quite performing so well. And so if we're thinking about where our growth comes from, if we're thinking about our schools that are around the average ICSEA, so ICSEA of 1,000 is set to be the average measure across Australia. So our kids are around about 1,000. There's challenge at both the front end and that lower performing end. Now, if we have a look, take a different slice and have a look at our category 2 schools and have a look at the story there, I can't show you the non-government schools because there aren't any. So in the data, there's nothing to compare to. There's a few schools there, but not enough to show you some data like this. Now, what's interesting is we see that same challenge with the offset of the Australian curve and the South Australian curve. But the shape of the South Australian curve is really different. That work that you have done, those of you who are working in these schools, that work that you have done, focusing on and pulling up the tail, as we call it, focusing on that, you can see that in the shape of the data. A real success for South Australia for those lower SES kids with this ICSEA around about 900, really pulling up the tail, and now the challenge to push out that front end. And if I do a similar thing here, with our category 6 schools with that higher ICSEA, again, no difference between the South Australian schools and the non-government schools. But we see that difference emerge again, really quite a bigger difference here between our South Australian schools at ICSEA 1100 and Australian schools. So we can start to see, of course, the nature of the challenge. And it's exactly what John was talking about before, that challenge of growth, but that challenge of pushing out into that higher performance whilst keeping that tail up. And we've had that story for a while, and we've been talking about that story for a while, and we can start to see our successes in terms of growth. We can start to really see those successes in terms of pulling the tail up. And now the challenge that I think we've been talking about over the last year or two has been about pushing that front end out. And so if we have a look at that kind of data, some of you have seen this analysis before, but the sorts of things that we've been looking at, and I know some partnerships have been looking at, some sites have been looking at, is if you look at things like the NAPLAN data, and this is the NAPLAN numeracy data that I want to talk about again. If you look at any paper, any NAPLAN paper, we can get the kids' scores on every single question. And so what I'm showing here is the percentage of students who have got a particular question right. And so as you go through any paper, what you see is that a high proportion of students nationally and in South Australia, a high proportion of students get the first couple of questions right, and as we go through the paper, it gets harder and harder, and fewer students get that question right. But it's not just, of course, that the questions get harder. What we've done is we've had a panel sit down and say, what's going on in this paper? And coded the questions according to whether it was a fluency-only question, a knowledge and know-how question, that what you'd be able to do is take off the shelf the knowledge that you've got and apply that, and those are shown in red. Or in blue, what we see there are those questions where we've said, these are the questions where you look at it, and this question is designed so that you look at it and go, I don't know what to do here. I don't know how to do that question. And it's designed so that then you've got to come up with your response to that question. So it's not just a knowledge and know-how question. You need knowledge and know-how, but it's reasoning and problem solving as well. And so we can see a change in the character of the paper as we go through. And so what we did was we started to code a lot of papers, and what we found was that the first quarter of the test was almost always knowledge and know-how dominated. And the last quarter of the test might have a knowledge and know-how question there from time to time, but was always problem-solving dominated. So what we did was we went back and said, okay, so let's just as a quick rule of thumb, something that might inform us, help us to ask questions of our data, help us to see some insight as to where growth might be needed. Let's separate it out into those 4 quarters. And so now, instead of all that complexity, we can have a quick look at let's say the national data, and see how the nation does, what proportion of the kids, about 80% in this example, get that first quarter of the test right compared to the second, third, and fourth quarter. So now what that allows us to do in your site, in your partnership, as a state, what we can do is we can say, so how are we going compared to the nation? How are we going compared to the nation on that first quarter of the test? You know, if 80% of the nation is getting that question right, what percentage of our students are getting that right? Is that 80%? If 80% of our students, then we're same as the national average. If ours was 40% of our students, then we'd be getting half the national average. So we can weigh ourselves against the national average. All kids do worse, or all cohorts of kids do worse on that last quarter of the test. But what we can see is we can compare ourselves to that 20% in this case of kids who get that right nationally. Is it 10% of our kids, which would be half, 20% of our kids, which would be exactly the same, maybe 30% of our kids, that would be 150% of that national performance. So we can see how well our kids are doing compared to the national average. So my first question for you is, where would your partnership be? Where do you think your partnership would be? I'm particularly interested in that first and that last quarter. If we were to draw that line in the middle and say this is 100% of how the national average, this is how the nation's going. On that first quarter of the test, the knowledge and know-how quarter of the test, how do you think your partnership's going? Is it getting Are you around about 100% of the national average? Are you the same as the nation? Are you a bit lower? Are you a bit higher? You can't go higher than 120% on that first quarter because of the high performance of everyone. And as we go through to the fourth quarter, how are your kids doing compared to the rest of the nation? Would you be about 100% of the nation? Not 100% in getting the questions right, but 100% of the national average. Where do you think you would be? I'm going to throw this over to you for a couple of minutes. So I'm going to share with you some of the state data. But the bigger picture point that I want to make is, of course, what I'm asking you to do is to notice something different about the data. This is the data that we already have in hand. This is our NAPLAN data. We already have it in hand, but what I'm asking you to do is to notice something different about it. This may not be your narrative. This may not be your story. Certainly, some of the work that we've been doing in Port Augusta, with the Port Augusta Quorn partnership, this has been their story. They've had a focus on this problem solving and been looking at this data and have got measurements of the effect size shift that they've had in this domain. So this may not be your story, but looking beneath the surface of the data to find your story, to find your narrative, to notice something different. That's available to us, but we don't always do it because of the way that the data is pitched at us or the way that we choose to interpret that data. So what we can do now with this particular analysis is we can have a look at, so how have we gone as a state? So now, because I'm comparing, let's say, my year 7s to the national cohort of year 7s in the first quarter of the test or the last quarter of the test, or comparing my year 5s, I'm saying how are my year 7s doing compared to other year 7s? I'm saying how are year 5s doing compared to other year 5s? How are our kids doing compared to other kids? So what I've done here is I've been able to average them all together because I'm not looking at particular scores, I'm looking at how are they going compared to other kids in the country. So I can compare across year groups, I can compare across time, and in this example what I've done is I've put them all together. And so what we see is that we can see 2015, and I can go back in time and look at the data and look at how we've gone and from the first quarter of the test through to the second quarter, third quarter, and fourth quarter of the test over time. So let me just turn this data around. And if I turn this data around, now what we can see is at the back, that's all of how did our kids do compared to the rest of the nation on that first quarter of the test on those knowledge and know-how questions. And as you can see, it was around about that 90% level. How did we go compared to the rest of the nation on the fourth quarter of the test? Not how well did we do, but how well did we do compared to everyone else? And what you can see is that on that fourth quarter of the test, we've dipped down to that more like that 60, 70% level. Now you might expect that. If you get 90% on the first quarter of the test, you would not necessarily get 90% on the fourth quarter of the test. So we might accept that, but it does raise some questions for us. Looking at big data sets in this way, all it ever does is raise some questions for us, I think. I don't think it ever tells us any answers. We can go down and drill deeper and look at individual year groups, and I think we might do a little bit of this in the Results Plus work that's coming up this year. But to simplify that complexity, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to have a look at the first quarter of each year group. How did we go over time in that first quarter? And then the last quarter of each year group. How did we go over time in that last quarter? Remember, this is performance compared to everybody else. So this is the NAPLAN numeracy data over those two quarters. So the first quarter on the left-hand side and the fourth quarter on the right-hand side. If we have a look at that first quarter first, what we can see is that the year 3 in dark blue, what we've seen is that we stayed around about that 95% level. In 2010, our kids were performing at 95% of the level of the rest of the country. That was true for year 5 and it was true for year 7. And one of the questions that this data raises is, what's going on at year 9? So our year 9 students were up at that 95% level, and then over the last few years, since 2012, that's dropped away, started to come back a little bit. When it doesn't tell us answers, it doesn't tell us what to do, it just raises questions for us. If we have a look at the fourth quarter, well, the first thing to notice, of course, is that the proportion of kids who, the comparison rate of our kids' performance compared to the rest of the country, that 100%, is lower in that fourth quarter compared to the first quarter. So those problem-solving questions, those reasoning questions, those questions where it says to the kids, here's a question, what would you do about this? Instead of, here's a question, what's the answer? When we ask our kids those questions, what we see is that we move from being in touch with the national average to being out of touch with the national average. I think this is a challenge for us, one way of seeing the challenge for us across the state. And so there's a number of things about this data. This data is a bit noisier because we're talking about lower percentages. I'm not sure you could say there was too much of a trends in either direction. But one of the things that's interesting to me is, look at that last year, the year from 2014 to 2015. That's the only part of any of these data, that's the only part of any of these charts where every year level has improved together. Both in this one and on that first quarter test, this is the only one where we've all moved together. Now, it might just be a statistical aberration, but if this is a shift, if this is a system-wide change, if we see this sustained over next year and the year after, we'll point back to this point and say this was a turning point. You look at that year from 2014 to 2015, and we've had some great successes there. Not in that first quarter of the test, but in the fourth quarter of the test. A real shift compared to everybody else. Doesn't matter if the test has got harder or easier, compared to everybody else, at every year level, in those problem-solving questions, we've improved compared to everybody else. So, what my next question for you is, why might this be? What do you think is going on there? What do you think has changed in the state that has allowed this change in student performance, particularly on those problem-solving questions, to change compared to the rest of the country? So no, I'm not giving you very long on this. And the thing about it is that we can't know. But as professionals, as leaders, what this data does is it allows us to ask some questions about why this might be. It allows us to think about why might it be, and how could it be? How could this have been? If it's real, if it's not just a statistical artifact, if it's real, what might have been going on? How could we amplify that? How can we capture some of that? Not losing sight of the idea of the competent child. Do we want this for our kids? I mean, that's almost a kind of rhetorical question when I presented it in the way that I have presented it. But for our kids, for pushing that front end forwards, for pulling the back of those curves that I showed you, for pulling those back, might this be a way forward to create those competent children, to create those competent young people, as well as get those NAPLAN results that we're looking for? So yes, I'm talking about the NAPLAN results, but of course I'm holding on to that idea of those competent children and developing those children. So if we think about the things that are changing, if we think about the things that we're noticing, or as James would say, the things to which we are agreeing to attend, I think one of the things is the administrative response that we've had. If you think about the SACE improvement work, that's been fantastic because of that administrative response, because it said, let's go back and have a look at our data. Let's use our administrative processes to look at our students' learning, to see how those kids are doing, and making sure that we're responding to those needs, that we're responding to not just the keeping the results up, not just the keeping the completion up, but the idea of being able to see those kids' competence over time, using the data in that way. But of course, the other thing that I think we've been talking about, the other thing that we've been noticing is what's been going on in the classroom. And I know, lots and lots of you, your successes have come from that way in which you've changed the challenge in the classroom. The way in which you've responded to things like that TEFL data that really focused on the idea of lots of teachers doing that relationship rescue. That their pedagogy was around maintaining the relationship rather than challenging and stretching the kids. That data that showed us about the teachers sometimes who were relying on a kind of script approach. And so those conversations that you've had in your sites about shifting that challenge, pulling up that tail for some of those kids that we've seen, pushing out that front end. Same content, same curriculum. We don't even have to change the curriculum as John was talking about, but changing the way in which we're thinking about that content, changing the nature of the challenge. And of course in the Results Plus work and in lots of the other things that we've been doing, that plusness, those other things, those things that contribute to the results, but the way in which they contribute to the results, the way in which they help us to get better NAPLAN results, to get better SACE results, is actually through developing the kids as competent children, developing those young people as competent adolescents. And John talked this morning about his concern about the yellow zone. And I think if we think about in South Australia, some of the things that we do that are in the yellow zone, in John's work and other work, other meta-analysis from around the world, play-based learning's in the yellow zone. It's very, very clearly in the yellow zone. Because on average, people don't do it very well around the world. But in South Australia, where I've seen play-based learning being used really, really effectively, where it's not just play, as play-based learning is around the world very often, it's got real intentionality behind it. Then it moves out of the yellow zone. Then it moves to be much more effective. The way in which we do these things makes a difference as to whether they're effective or not. Some big randomized control trial that's just come out of the UK in the last year or so that basically said classroom SSOs, in the UK at least, classroom SSOs, you'd be better off, they'd be more effective if they sat in the corner reading the newspaper than engaging with the kids, because it was actually in the red zone. Now that doesn't say that classroom SSOs are ineffective. What it says is, in the UK, on average, classroom SSOs are ineffective. But the way in which we use them, the way in which they're deployed, the way in which they're used to stretch and challenge the kids or rescue the kids, that's the thing that makes the difference. From the PISA work, science investigations are clearly in the red zone on average across the world. So these things that John was saying, of course, and as John said, this probabilistic approach allows us to ask some questions about what we're doing. And when things are in the yellow zone, it asks us a question about, well, how do we get them into the blue zone? How do we turn this thing into an ineffective intervention into an effective intervention? That data, that analysis is really important in asking us to what's going to contribute to the growth, what's going to contribute to this idea of this competent child. And so even in creative writing that John talked about, creative writing in itself, doing creative writing makes no difference. And in fact, as soon as you turn it into a program, Carol Dweck's work, the mindset work, and that paper that came out a couple of years ago showing that when you turn it into a program, you kill it. You rip the heart out of it. When you make everyone do it the same way, it doesn't work. When you put it together with your expectation, with your culture, with what teachers are noticing about the kids writing, what teachers are noticing about creativity, then it becomes really effective. It moves out of the yellow zone and into the blue zone. And so shifting things for us as leaders, that shifting things from the yellow zone into the blue zone, of course, is about our intention, is about our expectation, and is about our vigilance for that process, that intervention, that principle being used in a way that keeps it in the blue and out of the yellow. And John's point that John said that it's not that technology can't make a difference, but that it hasn't made a difference. The way in which we use it is the thing that makes the difference. And so if we think about that plusness, and again, I know some of you have seen this data before, but I wanted to share it again. If we think about that plusness and some of those things that make a difference for our kids, how we can change the expectation, how we can change what we're noticing, what we're choosing to attend to in our sites, what our teachers are choosing to attend to in their classrooms. If we think about things like disposition, this is some data mining work that we've done on the disposition measures for 15-year-olds in South Australia from the PISA data in 2014 that had a focus on mathematics. I just want to pick a few things out. There were a number of different measures of disposition, and you can see those across the bottom there, those different coloured points. And I just want to pick out the three that turned out to be the most important. So that's not necessarily the correlation, because this data is very messy, but it's a data mining measure called importance, which means that if you were to randomise that factor, how much impact would it have on performance? And so if you have a look at the South Australian data, what measure of disposition is the most important? And it comes back again, paralleling to some extent, though it's not a very close analogy, I don't think, the self-efficacy in the teachers. So in South Australia, the measure of disposition that has the most importance for performance is student self-efficacy. When students were asked questions like, how confident would you feel calculating the petrol consumption rate of a car, South Australian students felt less confident than any other group in the country. And yet when we asked them, how confident would you feel solving this equation, and it was a pretty complex quadratic equation, South Australian students actually were around about the national average in the level of confidence in responding to those questions. Every time a question was asked that said, how would you do this? Come up with a way of responding to this question, that's when we dropped out. When we had the question that said, solve this quadratic equation, and they could reach up on the shelf, grab the bit of algorithm or way of doing this thing and apply it to that problem, then we were the same as everyone else. But the thing that let us down was this, how would you feel like having a go at this? Knowing what to do when you don't know what to do. And that was the thing that turned out to be the most important, that self-efficacy. The next one was students' self-concept, the idea that they're just not good at maths. So that was one of the statements that they were asked to respond to, if they agreed with that statement or not. South Australians agree with statements like that quite a lot, and it has an impact on the performance. And then the last one I just wanted to point out was the levels of maths anxiety. And I've picked this one statement out. They were asked, to what extent do you agree with this statement? And I'll show you the level of South Australian students that agree with this statement. But it makes me sad, this statement. I feel helpless when doing maths problems. Not that I can't do them, but I just can't have a go. I feel helpless. I just don't know what to do. This is about 15-year-olds. But it's not. It's about the competence of our children, about the competence of our young people. How did they get to 15 and feel helpless? And so when we look at the levels of these indices, so at the top there I've got maths anxiety, and at the bottom I've got maths self-efficacy. And from left to right, we've got different states and territories. On the left-hand side of the screen, I've showed the female students. On the right-hand side of the screen, I'm showing the male students. And so what we see if we just look at the maths anxiety is that female students, their anxiety is higher than male students across the country, and the South Australian females are in fact the group that's got the highest level of maths anxiety in the country. Our boys don't seem so anxious, and yet their self-efficacy is the lowest in the country. They're not that confident about having a go, and they really don't care. So you get a picture of our kids, you get a picture of the disposition, of the competence, of the thing you can put your finger on and go, there's a thing there about growth. I can see how I could get growth there. You start to see when you get underneath the data, when you start to ask, what's your story? Do you see your kids in this? Or has your kids got a different story completely? You start to see something about the competence of the kids and how you would get the results through going through this idea of that building that competent child, that competent young person. This is a quote from Rahman Banga at Aberfoyle Park Primary School. Yes, I think that's right. No, not Aberfoyle Park. No. Augusta Park Primary School, sorry. Augusta Park Primary School. And she'd been working on student disposition. And if we've got time, I'll show you some more evidence from her about what she did in the classroom. She'd been working on her disposition. And one of the measures of success was in 2015 was that when NAPLAN came around, no one cried. And you can start to see it in the results, that the kids are changing. She's working on the disposition. That was her story. That was the narrative that was going on. And she changed it, and she could see the change in the kids because no one cried. And so this kind of data, of course, especially the big data at the state level, it doesn't give us answers. It can never give us answers. As John said, that work, this data that we've got, can't tell us what works or what's going to work. It can tell us what worked in the past. And so what it does do is it helps lead us to ask questions. It helps us to shape our strategic intent. Because if we rush in with the actions, with the thing that we're going to do, without thinking about that strategic intent and purpose, if we've not got our eye on that competent child, if we're not noticing what the data can tell us about our kids, and we're driven by just the data on its own, the data telling us that we must do better, that we've got to get kids into higher bands, that doesn't really help us. Particularly if in those ranges that I showed you at a particular ICSIA value, if you're at the top end of one of those ranges, what growth might look like might not be in your NAPLAN results. Because if you're at the top of that range for that particular ICSIA level, there's really nowhere to go. And so what growth might look like might be different. It might be in other measures. It might be in other ways. It might be in other ways of competence. It might be in other aspects of the general capabilities and other things that you would have your eye on as well anyway, but you might put more focus onto those things. And so what the data does is it allows us to think about some questions about our strategic intent, I think. John talked about writing for a purpose, and so I want to shift from numeracy and give some literacy, a writing example. And again, some of you might have worked with your staff with me, and we've talked about some of this work, but I want to put the leadership layer over it as well. One of the things that I use with my students at the university is I do this triple column note-taking where when we're having a learning experience, we've read something, we're watching something, we're doing something, I'll essentially ask them to split the page into 3, and on the right-hand side, write, what do you notice? Or something essentially like that. What's your surface response? What have you attended to within that thing? And then I might ask them, what do you think? In the middle column, and then the left-hand side, I'll ask them, so what? The reason why I do it from right to left is because when they come back to review this page, I know that they're going to read it in an F shape. They're going to read across the top and down the left-hand side. And so I don't want the most important stuff over on the right-hand side because I know they'll never read it. So I want them to put the most important stuff on the left-hand side. And so this idea of noticing, getting students sharp on noticing, and the teacher sharp on noticing what the students noticing, and the leader sharp on noticing, and won't be able to do it, what the teachers are noticing about what the kids are noticing. That layer of competence we can see in terms of what the students are doing and how I'm responding to the students. And I'm going to play you this truncated clip, so it's just a minute or two, from Anne Penner, who's a teacher at Curtin Point Primary School, and she used that framework, or the principles of that framework, and said, I'm not doing it like that, I'll do it my own way. I will enact those principles in my own way.
I'm a Year 1-2 teacher at Curtin Point, and last term our written goal was to write a persuasive text. And we were using the text, dogs make the best pets. So in class we bought some hermit crabs and we were aiming to write our own persuasive text on hermit crabs make best class pets. So I made up a writing template for the kids and the heading was hermit crabs. And I had 3 columns which were, what do you notice about hermit crabs? What do you like about the hermit crabs? And what questions do you have about the hermit crabs? From there, over a period of about 3 weeks, we'd get the hermit crabs out and we'd sit around our mat and we'd look at the hermit crabs and we'd talk about what we noticed or what we liked and what questions we had. And then the kids went away and wrote. And I found this really useful as a teacher because I was able to look at their thinking and then ask questions or set up scenarios that would help to develop their thinking. So for example, one day I put all the hermit crabs in the middle of the room and put them upside down, and usually the kids wanted to save the hermit crabs, but this day I told them they weren't allowed to touch them. So the hermit crabs were upside down and we waited, and all of a sudden the hermit crabs fully extended themselves out of the shell and were able to use their legs to turn themselves the right way and to move around. And the kids were just amazed and they loved it, and this built another great conversation about what they noticed, and they then went away and wrote about it. as the weeks progressed, the kids wrote a lot and they were able to sort their thinking into the 3 different columns. At the end of the term, we constructed a joint construction of persuasive text, why hermit crabs make the best class pets, and the more able children went away and just wrote paragraphs as to why they thought hermit crabs made the best class pets. And in year 1 level, they really only need to write that hermit crabs do make the best class pets, but the kids with all their information were able to give up to 4 reasons per paragraph, so their writing was of a really high standard.
So let me share with you some of the writing that the kids did. There's the template that she used to start off with. What Anne would do was she would hand out the template, the kids would write something, she'd get it back in, she'd write a challenge to stretch the kids, hand it back out, and they'd have this iteration of stretch, 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 stretch every time that the kids did something. If we have a look at some of the things that the kids noticed, there's 4 of them, they don't change shells very often. Notice that the legs come out first, and then the feelers, and then the eyes. And then the questions that they had. Can they make, I'm not sure if it's noises or houses. Houses, I think. Can they make houses? Can they survive on top of a very, very high, high mountain? Great question. I don't know where it comes from. You got the last one? Do they spew? Is it a girl? Who's a girl and who is a boy? Do they run? Are they babies? Yes, do they fart? Do they spew? That was obviously a conversation. But of course, what was important about that was, at the end they got their questions, and what makes hermit crabs a good class pet? When they nip you, it tickles, they are lovely, and they are very interesting to watch. So I'll pay those things. And what you can see in it is it's multi-structural. What the kids said about their questions or what they noticed had absolutely nothing to do with what makes a hermit crab a good class pet at the end. But what you can see in it is the stretch and the challenge. What you can see in it is the expectation of the teacher that she's focused on noticing. And in going for the noticing, and the kids developing this identity as noticers, the things that they've noticed have given them something to write about. And so by giving them that something to write about, the quality and amount of their writing has gone through the roof. If I go back to James, one of the things that James said, I might just pause and let you read this on your own. The language is quite difficult. An intellect unfurnished with materials will hardly be likely to consider any subject long. A glance exhausts its possibilities of interest. What Anne had done, of course, was to slow things down. What Anne had done was to get the kids to get their thinking out and to use their thinking. She kept coming back to the hermit crabs so that the subject would bud and sprout and grow, so that every moment would have a new consequence that would rivet the attention afresh. And so she started to talk about noticers. The shift that she'd done, the shift in terms of the competent child, the shift that she'd done was about the kids noticing. But she didn't do that in isolation, of course. Heather can close her eyes. I talked with Heather, the principal, and asked Heather about what did she expect to notice in those classrooms, and how, when she went into her classrooms, could she see her expectations being put into action.
And there's a change in
Let me start again.
There's a change in language that teachers are now using with kids, and there's a change in the language that they're expecting children to use. And what I mean by this is, in the teachers' planning, I'd noticed that it's actually riddled with questions right through their planning that they are wanting to ask, or that they want kids to ask. And what I've observed in classrooms is that kids are asking more questions, and those questions are actually being documented and put up on word walls or actually highlighted in big labels, and children are finding answers to those and from their friends' questions and talking about it. What I've seen in our school is that teachers are valuing, and therefore children are valuing, what other people are saying about their learning, but they're also being able to express themselves in writing at a far higher level because they've actually thought through the processes of learning. They've actually thought about it and talked about it before they actually come to write it. They're not being asked to document stuff from the onset. They're being asked to wonder and think and question and predict, and that enables them therefore to articulate it more, both orally and in writing.
So this is just one example. I could have picked, there's many, many examples that we've seen right across South Australia of where what the leader has done is the leader has created an expectation. And when the leader's gone into those classrooms, the teacher within those classrooms know what that expectation is. But the enactment of that expectation might be different in different classrooms. But what the leader has expected has been there, and it's changed what the teachers have expected of the kids. And so in that growth, where we're getting that growth from, if you look around the place, where we're getting that growth from is where leaders have shifted their expectation, and that's flowed down to the expectation and that challenge that the kids have been experiencing. So let me ask you this question. Within what Heather said there, what particularly did you notice? What were the things that Heather said within the things that you do? I want to ask you, what do you notice? What did you attend to within that? But how does that link to what you're already doing in your sites? How does what she did in terms of her expectation match the things that are going on in terms of your expectation in your classrooms, or the things that you're working on as a partnership? Over to you for a couple of minutes. The sorts of things that I'd picked up, the sort of things that you might have picked up on, some of the things that Heather was saying was about that clarity of expectation. She communicated that expectation. There was a clarity there. She was looking for evidence of it in a classroom. She wasn't just creating that expectation and then standing back. And also that holding the line. So the conversations with the staff, the conversations with the teachers, whether that be at professional learning, staff meetings, other things, holding the line on that and holding on to those conversations. Karen Butler on the Twitter asked a great question, and she asked, do leaders set the expectations, or are they co-constructed with teachers? And what a great comment, that point about the strategic intent being something that we co-construct, and that might be a relationship between the leaders and the teachers, and of course between the teachers and the kids, letting the kids in on this secret of this is our joint project of development together. This developing you as noticers. And when in Anne's clip, in the longer version of that clip, and when I talked with Anne, what she talked about was a kid who went to the library and was reading getting some information about elephants. They were doing some work on elephants, and the kid said that I've noticed something, I need to write it down. She developed herself, the metacognitive language, if you like, but the language about the learning was about being a noticer. And they co-constructed this idea as the kids had been let in on the secret. And so the kids became noticers, knew that they were noticers, and that transferred into their writing, then the quality of the writing. And that work reminded me of this work from the Education Endowment Foundation, who were supported by the UK government, but are independent now, and the Sutton Trust that John mentioned earlier. And they did a big report on a randomised control trial about improving writing, and it was about it was a self-regulated strategy. It was about slowing the kids' thinking down, having something that the kids wanted to write about, so there was an event that the kids wanted to write about, but the kids had noticed things, but they slowed the kids down in terms of constructing their thinking, constructing their response, and then putting putting the pen to paper, then actually starting the writing, but not rushing to the writing, in exactly the same way that Heather talked about. And look at the effect sizes. what we see is an effect size there of the intervention group compared to the control group of 0.74. And then when they did that same work with, as it says, free school meal students or lower SES students, an absolutely enormous effect size. They're repeating this now because they only had 86 pupils in that study. But it does raise some questions to us about what gets you better results, what gets you better writing. Doing more writing isn't necessarily it, both for pulling up the tail and pushing out the front end for the lower performers and the higher performers. Doing more writing, doing of the doing might not be it. Getting control of your thoughts and actions might be it. This doesn't tell us what to do. It enables us to ask some questions. And the things that John, connecting back to what John talked about this morning, that thing about the way in which leaders can have the biggest impact is controlling the narrative of your school, controlling that expectation, the thing about the notices, the thing about the stop and think to do the writing. We're going to get better writing through doing this. Being vigilant for that improvement and that growth and being able to respond to that, to amplify what's working well and to dampen down what's not working well. We know that best practice, Don talked about it this morning, that best practice doesn't work in education because it's too complex. There can be no such thing as simple best practice. And so both from teachers and leaders' point of view, dealing with the complex and complicated nature of education means that we have to be vigilant for that growth and be ready to dampen things that don't work and amplify things that do work. I wasn't able to find Martin this morning when I talked to him. I hope you don't mind me showing your first newsletter from earlier this year when you arrived at the school. But in Martin Lippett's newsletter from Parafield Gardens High School this year, Martin talked about the successes that they've had at the school. And if you look at the successes that they've had, what he's done is over the years, and of course Martin's new to the school this year, but over the years they've held the line on this success breeds success and reported it to the parents, talked about how they're reducing the D's and E's, pulling up that tail and pushing out that front end, getting more kids into the A bands. And I particularly wanted to pick out this part of the newsletter where they're reporting on the students that have received merits. Parafield Gardens doesn't get a whole lot of merits, but this year they got 6 merits in the research project. Last year they got 6 merits in the research, 5 or 6 merits in the research project. There is something going on at that school where the expectation of the leadership is flowing down into the kids. And when we ask Ingrid Lees and people who are involved in that project, what's changed? What did you notice? And what they've talked about is that high expectation that they've put in place for the kids, that the kids can respond to that. They've got a narrative about their kids responding to that high expectation. And what they've seen across the board is, what they're noticing about their kids is that they can change the kids' expectations, they can change their expectations of the kids, pull up the tail, push out the front, and get those merits in things like the research project. So, come back to this point about James, about my experience is what I agree to attend to. What am I getting the kids to attend to? What at Parafield Gardens are they getting the kids to attend to? It's not just about high expectations, about getting better grades. It's about noticing what the kids are attending to, what they're not attending to, then having expectation around that. Let me show you a research example from some physics research. This is a physics question. It looks like a standard question. Let me zoom out a little bit. Looks a bit like a NAPLAN question. And what they did with this question in the research was they looked at the way that people looked at the question. And so the question is a standard physics question. What we've got is a cart on top of a hill there, and it's going to roll down the hill and end up in that final position. And we've got situation A where the cart's going to roll down the big hill, and situation B where the cart's going to roll down the little hill. There's no friction involved and all those things that happens in physics problems. What the researchers looked at was, what do the students notice about this? And what they found was that the people who were unsuccessful tended to look at the deep dip, the very wiggly line with that deep dip. The people who were successful tended to look at the starting position and the final position of the cart, because that's all that matters in this question. The route that the cart takes doesn't matter. And so in your physics learning, you will have learned that the route doesn't matter, but where the cart starts and where the cart ends is the important thing. And so what they did in the research was they gave people this question, and in the research, they flashed a yellow highlighter on the cart at the beginning and end. And that's all they did. They cued the question, but what they did was they cued what people looked at. They put this flashing light over the relevant bit to change what people looked at. And what they found was the proportion of students who got this right doubled. The kids knew it. They had the knowledge and know-how to answer the question. What they couldn't do was put it together. The cueing, the thing that they thought about, the thing that they noticed, was the wrong thing. And so what I'm wondering is, what might your wiggly line be? What might the cueing that we get cued to do be? Well, how are we noticing perhaps the wrong things? What John talked about this morning was how the bright kids pick out the right instructions. What they're doing is they're noticing the right bit of this to be successful. Lots of the kids would have the knowledge and know-how, would be able to turn to the right page if they knew that that was the important thing, but they're noticing the wrong thing. John talked about how, teachers talking about how my job here today is to notice the impact that I have on my children. Notice what's going on, cueing the right thing, the impact on the children, perhaps rather than what I'm doing. And so if you think about what Heather was talking about, Heather was cueing her staff's thinking through her expectations and modelling. And in her classroom, Anne was cueing her children's thinking through her expectations and modelling. And even deeper than that, when John was talking this morning about the best teachers, how they see something in students that they don't necessarily see in themselves, they're cueing something different in the students. They're cueing the way that they think. I'm just going to go back one step and just again throw to you for a couple of minutes. What is it that's cued in your sites? How do people cue your thinking? How does the data that you get and the way it's presented to you cue particular thinking in your partnership? And what else would you like to notice? Over to you for a couple of minutes again. All day with the things that we've been talking about the data, the things that we've been talking about the way in which we respond to the data, the things which we might notice, the not doing things in the old way, not doing things in a linear way. It strikes me that when I look at the research around the cognitive psychology of entrepreneurial thinking, that actually that's what we're asking you to do. That's what we're asking the teachers to do. In fact, that's what we're asking the kids to do, to be able to respond to this, to be entrepreneurial within the thinking. I'm not going to talk about this, we haven't got time, but this framework around entrepreneurial thinking I think can be useful to us to think about that plusness, to think about what we're noticing, and particularly to think about how we're acting upon opportunities. How we're asking questions and noticing opportunities as leaders, how we're asking teachers to do the same, and how we're asking kids to do the same. This joint project of the development of the competent child or the competent young person. I do, though, want to share with you some thoughts from a great thinker. These thoughts are from a few years ago. You might not recognize who it is at first. Some of you will, because I know that some of the partnerships I've worked with have seen this. Let me just play it. You have some sound? Oh,
to get told that the world...
Let's start again.
So the thing I would say is, when you grow up, you tend to get told that the world is the way it is, and your life is just to live your life inside the world, try not to bash into the walls too much, try to have a nice family life, have fun, save a little money. But life, that's a very limited life. Life can be much broader once you discover one simple fact, and that is everything around you that you call life was made up by people that were no smarter than you. And you can change it. You can influence it. You can build your own things that other people can use. And the minute that you understand that you can poke life and actually something will, if you push in, something will pop out the other side, that you can change it, you can mold it, that's maybe the most important thing, is to shake off this erroneous notion that life is there and you're just going to live in it, versus embrace it, change it, improve it, make your mark upon it. I think that's very important. And however you learn that, once you learn it, you'll want to change life and make it better, because it's kind of messed up in a lot of ways. Once you learn that, you'll never be the same again.
If you didn't pick it, that was Steve Jobs talking about the early years learning framework. No, he wasn't. But it could have been. It could have been talking about the early years learning framework. It could have been talking about some of the structures that we have with our curriculum. It could have been talking about the general capabilities. It could have been talking about a competent child. It could have been talking about the things that we're doing, the things that I see in South Australia, those projects that work with the TEFL pilot and other things where that student voice is coming through so strongly, where students are those active participants poking life, poking their learning. They're seeing those opportunities and they're making the most of those opportunities. With Anne's kids being noticers, both poking the hermit crabs and not poking the hermit crabs, and holding them back and having that intent of slowing down the thinking and having them not jump in. The difference between, the kids who do the SACE and can answer the questions, and the kids who do their SACE and don't just answer the questions but give themselves to it, notice something within it, like those kids at Parafield Gardens High School. Let me show you one more thing from Steve Jobs.
Now, I've actually always found something to be very true, which is most people don't get those experiences because they never ask. I've never found anybody that didn't want to help me if I asked them for help. I always call them up. I called up, this will date me, but I called up Bill Hewlett when I was 12 years old, and he lived in Palo Alto. His number was still in the phone book. And he answered the phone himself. He said, yes? I said, hi, I'm Steve Jobs. I'm 12 years old. I'm a student in high school, and I want to build a frequency counter. And I was wondering if you had any spare parts I could have. And he laughed, and he gave me the spare parts to build this frequency counter, and he gave me a job that summer in Hewlett-Packard, working on the assembly line, putting nuts and bolts together on frequency counters. He got me a job in the place that built them. And I was in heaven. And I've never found anyone who said no or hung up the phone when I called. I just asked. And when people ask me, I try to be as responsive, to pay that debt of gratitude back. Most people never pick up the phone and call. Most people never ask. And that's what separates sometimes the people that do things from the people that just dream about them. You gotta act. And you've got to be willing to fail. You've got to be willing to crash and burn. With people on the phone, with starting a company, with whatever. If you're afraid of failing, you won't get very far.
It strikes me that the strengths that we've got in South Australia, things like the partnerships, things like our relationships with each other, things like the very fact that we're all in the same room, means that we can pick up the phone, we can work together, we can learn from each other's strengths. And the same with the kids. I think when we see the kids, I was talking a brief conversation at lunchtime with Ned Lords at Woodden. I don't know where you are, Ned, and talking about how one of the challenges for the kids there is this propensity to act, to notice an opportunity and take that opportunity, to transform the kids from being passive to active. That's what's underneath our data. That shift is what's underneath our data, and I think that shift that we've started to enact in South Australia, if that increase in the problem-solving, the problem-solving achievement, that growth in that problem-solving achievement that we can see in the data, I think you can see it every day in our schools, where you as leaders and teachers, together with the kids, are changing the expectations and changing the way that we think about learning. You know me, this is my email address, and you can get me on Twitter as well. The sorts of things that I'd like you to leave you with and to perhaps tweet about over the next couple of minutes are, why is it that we've moved in that direction? Why do you think we've moved in that same direction together? This isn't just one year group, but across the whole state, we've seen that shift in that direction in NAPLAN. Because I think we've had this ongoing conversation, we've had the administrative response, and we've had this pedagogical educational response. What's your wiggly line? What's that deep line that you're being distracted by, that you're being pulled away to give some attention to, as John talked about this morning, those distractors? What are the things that you've been forced to think about the wrong thing? And what would you want to notice? Or what would you want through your data and through other things to be able to notice? I look forward to working with you over the rest of this year. Thanks very much.